Hey, everybody. So, are we ready to talk a little bit about ethics and moral decision making? I know I am. Actually, it's a pretty cool lesson. We are looking at chapter 9 right now. Go ahead and pull that up. So, yes, this lesson all about ethics and how we apply ethics and morality to decision making. And obviously, this can take on a very important role in sort of bigger, more controversial topics, but it is also a concept that we need to be aware of and kind of learn how to apply critical thinking skills to, because ethics and morality actually show up in our everyday lives. Obviously, it's on a much smaller scale than what we're used to seeing when we think about ethics and morality in the wider cultural view. So, sort of those hot topic, controversial issues when it comes to sort of ethics in business and corporations, when it comes to politics, when it comes to the law, right? So, I think that when we hear the phrases ethics and moral decision making, we have a tendency to immediately go to those bigger perspectives. And we don't necessarily think about the ways that ethics and morality are playing a role on a smaller scale in our everyday lives. So we're going to kind of look at how, ethics and morality show up all around. We are going to kind of talk about how, they apply in those larger scenarios, but also how, we need to be aware of these things and incorporating them with our critical thinking skills every day. All right. So we're going to start off with a little scenario here. And this scenario actually comes into play in one of your Chapter 9 questions on this week's written responses assignment. So if you get to that question and you're like, I don't know what she's talking about, it's this, right? So suppose you are the captain and star player on your college basketball team, and your team has made it to the final. A wealthy entrepreneur, he is an avid basketball fan, and he happens to be an alumnus of your college, has promised to make a $60 million donation to your school if your team wins the finals. Now, we're going to sidestep the fact that that's, kind of a jerk move to make that money contingent upon a win, but that's this person's prerogative. They're the one with the money. They're the one willing to give it to your school if your team wins that final game. Right? Your college desperately needs the money. It is currently in serious financial trouble. It's been forced to cut back on academic programs, right? So this is an opportunity for something coming from the athletic side of the college to help, rebuild or save the academic side of the college, which, as much as we love college sports, colleges exist for the academics, right? Okay. A few weeks before the game, that same entrepreneur who is offering that $60 million donation for a win comes to you and offers you a band performance enhancing substance known as I'm going to mess this up, aren't I? Tetrahydrogestrinone. We're going to call it THG. So it's a new designer steroid, right? He's offering this to you. Of course, you express concern at getting caught, and he assures you that you won't get caught because THG has been cloaked to avoid detection by drug tests. He also tells you that he will make a $6 million donation. It's only 1/10 of the original amount he promised, but he will donate $6 million even if your team loses. but only on the condition that you take the drug for the next 2 weeks and give the game your best effort. And the team you're playing has won the finals the past 3 years in a row. So you're kind of the underdog going in, and you need every bit of, luck and help and skill and whatnot to make sure that you can pull off a win against this reigning team. So he says, if you take this performance enhancing drug, which, yes, is banned, but is cloaked so that it won't show up on any tests, you won't get caught. If you take this performance enhancing drug for the next 2 weeks to at least give your team the best chance possible of winning, I will make a $6 million donation to your school, even if you guys lose. But if you win, you still get the $60 million donation. What should you do? Your school desperately needs the money, and you could do a lot of good for your school by taking the drug. On the other hand, what about the possible physical harms of steroids to you, yourself? Right? So you have your own health and well-being to consider. Also, would it be fair to the other team or to sports fans in general if you had an advantage because of this banned drug? Right? So, you aren't getting anything individual for this. He's not donating, he's not giving you money personally for taking the drug. He's making the donation to your school, which then benefits how many people? A lot, right? But are you putting yourself in harm's way by taking this drug? And, is it fair? Is it right? What should you do? So, the situation just described is an example of a moral conflict that requires you to engage in moral reasoning. So, we are confronted with moral decisions every day in our lives. Fortunately, most of them are pretty straightforward, and they're so commonplace and so sort of ingrained in us culturally that we often don't realize that we are making moral decisions. It's not until we take a step back and really think about these situations and the choices we make that we realize that there's an element of morality involved. But things like keeping our promises, that's an element of ethics and morality. Waiting our turn in line, right? We think that they're just cultural values, but they're more than that. That's a moral decision to wait your turn. We don't steal someone else's laptop when their backs are turned. We're going to get into the different types of moral theories that attempt to explain why we make these moral decisions to keep our promises, to wait our turn in line, to not steal someone's laptop even when we could probably not get caught, and why we offer help to those in need, right? There are different takes on why we ultimately choose these paths, but the fact is they are moral decisions. And although, we might not even be aware that we've engaged in moral reasoning, we have, right? So we may not be facing a situation where someone is willing to donate, a boatload of money for us to take a performance enhancing drug, but we are faced with moral decisions on a daily basis, right? Taking that to a larger scale, there's probably no other area where people are prone to engage in rhetoric and resistance as in debates over controversial moral issues. So when we talk about standing in line, waiting our turn, not stealing someone's laptop, trying to help those in need, we we don't find those weaknesses quite as much. When we take it to a larger scale, and we're talking about those controversial moral issues, that's when the use of rhetoric starts to happen. And remember, rhetoric is when you are appealing to logic, you're appealing to emotions, or you're appealing to credibility to persuade people to agree with you. Remember, the goal of rhetoric is to win. And the problem with rhetoric most of the time is that it skips the stage of argument. Which, remember, argument is simply trying to find the truth, trying to find, to gather as much information from as many perspectives as possible so that you can then form your own point of view on that issue. Then, if we take it to the next step of rhetoric, and we are now trying to persuade someone to agree with us, then the rhetoric isn't a bad thing necessarily, because we're coming from a position where we have, considered every point of view. We've been respectful of every point of view. We have gathered as much information and knowledge as possible, right? It's just we skip that step a lot of the time. And when we sort of debate these controversial moral issues, the rhetoric involved has indeed often skipped that step. Resistance. All of the types of resistance that we learned about back in week 1, it shows up when we start to debate controversial moral issues. But our critical thinking skills can help us evaluate moral issues from multiple perspectives, just like argument did, as well as break through those patterns of resistance. And again, that's what argument is meant to do as well. We're meant to be aware of all of those barriers to critical thinking so that we can identify when others are putting up those barriers, but also, more importantly, to recognize our own barriers to critical thinking and to begin working on those to break those patterns of resistance, right? Once you start to do that, you start looking at things from multiple perspectives and considering information from all different sides of the issue, that's critical thinking. And we've seen how it can be used in sort of standard arguments, but we can't forget to apply it pretty much the same way, even when we're dealing with ethics and morality. All right, so we're going to be looking at how to make moral decisions in our everyday lives, as well as how to think about and discuss controversial moral issues. So what is moral reasoning? We engage in moral reasoning when we make a decision about what we ought to do or what we ought not to do, or perhaps it's, we're debating or we're trying to decide the most reasonable or just position or policy regarding a particular issue, right? Effective moral decision-making depends on good critical thinking skills, familiarity with basic moral values, and the motivating force of moral sentiments. We're going to be looking at those. All right, so moral values and happiness. Aristotle, ancient Greece here, Aristotle taught that morality is sort of the foundation, it's the most fundamental expression of our rational human nature, the rational side, not the emotion side. That morality is the most fundamental expression of our rational human nature, and that we are happiest when we put moral values above non-moral values. Because that's not to say that a non-moral value doesn't have value. It just means that it's a different type of value. It's not a moral value, right? The association of morality with happiness and a sense of well-being is actually found in moral philosophies throughout the world. So it's a very sort of fundamental part of the human existence, believed to be the case around the world through time, that we are happiest when we put moral values ahead of non-moral values, right? Now, what are moral values, right? Moral values are the values that benefit yourself and others. And these are the type of values that are worthwhile for their own sake, right? So they include altruism, compassion, tolerance, forgiveness, justice, right? Altruism is when you prioritize the well-being of others, even at your own sacrifice, right? That your nature, our nature, is to help those in need, or to simply help, even if the person's not necessarily in need, but to place more importance on someone else's well-being. And perhaps the easiest way to sort of explain that or give you an example is the way most of us feel about our children, right? I mean, how many parents have used that hyperbolic, phrase like, I would walk through fire for my child, right? I would take a bullet for my child, right? Like, it's placing their well-being ahead of yours. Or even, thinking realistically, because most of us aren't really ever going to be faced with that decision to walk through fire or take a bullet for our children. Some do, sadly, but most of us don't. So we're never really put to that test, I guess. But we do little things, how many parents out there struggling economically will make sure that their children are fed, even if they have to go hungry? How many parents just make sure that their children and families are happy, even at their own detriment, right? Even something simple as, perhaps when you were younger, and you're looking at a pizza, right? And you're sharing it with other people, and, there's one slice left, and 2 or 3 of you want that last slice. What do you do when you're younger, right? I don't know. You fight it out. You just take it, like, they can deal with it. You rock, paper, scissors it, you're not just willing to give up the other slice because someone else wants it, right? But when you're a parent, you will do that. You will gladly do that. Even adults who aren't parents can do that, can still feel that sense of, I really want this last slice of pizza, but my friend here, who is someone I care about, really wants it too. You know what? That's okay. I want them to be happy. Simple thing, right? That's altruism. Compassion. Compassion is when our empathy and sympathy for another person's struggle prompts us to act, to take action. Tolerance, we know what tolerance is, forgiveness, justice, those are all moral values. They benefit ourselves, they benefit others, and they are worthwhile for their own sake. It's just good to show compassion. It's just good to be tolerant. It's just right to show forgiveness, right? Then we have our non-moral values, or instrumental values. These are goal-oriented values. They are a means to an end that we wish to achieve. So things like independence, prestige, fame, popularity, wealth, none of those are bad necessarily. They just aren't at the same level as moral values are, right? So, although many Americans regard non-moral values such as career success, financial prosperity, flashy materialism as a means to happiness, right? So going back to that slide, what we're learning here basically is that these values, our moral values, are the ones that we should prioritize, because when we prioritize them, humanity has shown for research through across the world and throughout time have shown that when we prioritize those moral values, we are happier. But yet, we have a tendency to prioritize the non-moral or instrumental values instead. And research shows that those don't bring as much happiness, and unless you are incredibly poor. When you are at the lowest levels of income, where happiness is lowest, then some of those instrumental non-moral values, as you achieve them, they can add to happiness. But if you are, if you're doing okay, and you are not struggling to exist, even if you feel like you are, if you have a house, you have a car, if you have a job, if you have a cell phone, you're able to not go hungry, even if you feel like you want more or deserve more, that's not the same thing as being at those lowest levels of income and where happiness is hard to come by. But even those of us in that lower middle class zone, research shows that, prioritizing those instrumental values it doesn't make us happy. We are still happiest when we prioritize those moral values, right? There's also a positive correlation between the level of moral reasoning you have and critical thinking ability. Remember, a positive correlation: when one goes up, the other goes up. Not causal, right? We learned about faulty causal arguments, correlation, right? So positive correlation between moral reasoning and critical thinking ability, which really shouldn't be surprising, because we know critical thinking requires not only that we be aware of our own values, but that we be open-minded and willing to respect the concerns of other people. So it's not really come as a surprise that the stronger someone's critical thinking skills are, the more likely it is that their level of moral reasoning will be such that they are prioritizing those moral values over the instrumental values, and therefore happy. All right. When we fail to take appropriate moral action, failing to take an appropriate moral action, or making a decision that we later regret, we commit what is called a moral tragedy. So I want you to think back to week 1 when we talked about the Milgram study. Remember, Milgram was the guy who was like, everyone around the world is looking at these Nazi war criminals, listening to them say, I didn't do anything wrong, I was just following orders. And everyone around the world is like, dude, that's crap. Like, no, you knew it was wrong. That's not an excuse. Like, if you know right from wrong, then you don't do wrong. And, it doesn't matter who's in charge. I would never do that just because I was told to. Milgram's like, I wonder if that's true. So he conducts this experiment, right? We have everybody's in on it, right? So we have these students who are being asked questions, right? And the authority figure in the white lab coat with clipboard running the whole thing. And then we have our volunteers who are totally unaware of what's happening. They come in and they are there to deliver electric shocks to the student every time they get an answer wrong. And with each wrong answer, the voltage increases. And obviously, there's no actual shock happening. The student who is providing the wrong answers and receiving the shock is acting. But obviously, our volunteers don't know this. They think they are truly delivering pain to these people. And when they got uncomfortable with it and, we're like, dude, do I keep going? Like, I don't really want to do this anymore. This doesn't seem right. The guy in the lab coat with the clipboard is like, no, the experiment requires that you continue. And most of them did. Most of them knowingly and willingly kept delivering the shock, even though they knew it was wrong, right? They knew what they were doing was morally wrong, but they lacked the necessary critical thinking skills to come up with counter arguments every time the guy's clipboard was like, the experiment requires you must continue. That is a moral tragedy. I know that sounds very exaggerated, moral tragedy, but it is. That's the definition of a moral tragedy, is failing to take appropriate moral action or make a decision that we later regret. Right? And when we're thinking of the Nazi war criminals, we knew that was a moral tragedy. We knew that was wrong. We just thought we were immune to the conditions that would prompt someone to make a decision that was morally wrong. Not critical thinking skills. Right? So that leads us to our conscience and moral sentiments. A well-developed conscience provides us with knowledge about what is right and wrong. Right? We hear the phrase guilty conscience, right? Provides us with knowledge about what is right and what is wrong. The interesting thing with conscience is that it's a lot like language. The basic structure is innate. It's in us. Our conscience is either nurtured or neglected and shaped by our family, religion, and culture, like language. Conscience has an affective or emotional element that motivates us to act on this knowledge of right and wrong. So it taps into our emotions. And effective moral reasoning involves listening to that affective side of our conscience, that emotional side, as well as the cognitive and reasoning side. And that really shouldn't come as a surprise either, because we had a whole chapter on reason and emotion and how the two seem completely polar opposites and antithetical to each other, but really are complementary. And in good critical thinking, you're going to be tapping into both sides. Same thing with morality. So tapping into that affective side, we have what are called moral sentiments. These are emotions that alert us to moral situations and motivate us to do what is right. So some common moral sentiments, we're going to look at each of these, are helper's high, empathy and compassion, moral outrage, resentment, guilt, and shame. So first we have our helper's high. Pretty easy. Helper's high occurs when you experience an endorphins rush after helping others. It can give you a high, and it's followed by a period of relaxation and improved self-esteem. So that's an emotional reaction, right? Tapping into that emotional side of our conscience, and it prompts us to do something. It's a little self-serving, perhaps, because we get to experience the helper's high, but it's still an emotional connection that prompts action. We have empathy. Empathy is the capacity for, imagining what others are feeling. It's the idea of being able to walk in someone else's shoes and, feel for them. Because even though you have never experienced anything like what they're experiencing, you can still imagine what it would feel like, and you can share that set of emotions with them. And this is, where we are happy because someone else is happy, and we're sad when someone else is sad, right? Compassion is empathy in action. It involves taking steps to relieve others' unhappiness, right? Most of us are able to feel empathy or sympathy for others. We don't always show compassion. Compassion is action. Furthermore, we're often able to show compassion and actually act when we are dealing with someone who is similar to us. But we know that we have a tendency to fall into that barrier of critical thinking where we divide the world into us versus them. And so anyone who is in the us category, we are more likely to show compassion to, more likely to act on our empathy. Anyone who's in the them category, we may not even be able to muster the empathy, right? But even when we do, we're less likely to show compassion. All right. Moral outrage, another moral sentiment, so another emotional piece to moral reasoning. And it's also known as moral indignation. So it occurs when we witness an injustice or a violation of moral decency. And moral outrage motivates us to correct unjust situations by demanding justice. And you can find real, honest to goodness moral outrage that has been the catalyst for truly important change in culture and society. You can definitely find fake moral outrage as well, especially in the age of the internet and social media. It's, kind of like virtue signaling on social media, where, it's like by changing our profile picture to a flag or to a symbol, showing our support. But are we really trying to correct anything? Or are we just trying to seem like, we are moral? It's a fine line. But don't think that moral outrage is wrong or that it's not real, because it is. And it is a very useful tool for reform and justice when it's real and it truly prompts people, truly motivates people to seek change. We also have what's called resentment, right? It is a type of moral outrage, but this is different. A moral outrage in its true form is when we feel like someone else has experienced some sort of injustice or moral violation, right? Resentment is when it's ourselves who have experienced, some sort of injustice. So moral outrage and resentment, they go together. It's just resentment is personal to us. Moral outrage is what we feel for others. And, moral outrage, calls our attention to injustice, but and that can prompt us to want, motivate us to want to help make change and seek justice and reform. But if we don't have effective moral reasoning and critical thinking skills, we might fail to act, or we may respond ineffectively. If we're not, it's good to feel that, that feeling and be motivated to want to help bring about change. But if we're not able to reason morally and use critical thinking skills to assess the situation and come up with plans of action, then the moral outrage might end up doing more harm than good. Right? It can, if we're not using moral reasoning and critical thinking skills, that is when moral outrage and resentment can sort of degenerate into bitterness, blame, or helplessness. So very useful, both of those, moral outrage and resentment, but only if harnessed along with moral reasoning and critical thinking skills. We have Rosa Parks here. She's just a great historical figure that sort of represents moral outrage and resentment. Moral outrage at what other people were experiencing, but she was actually experiencing the same thing. That's why it says her feelings of resentment. And we tend to view resentment as a very negative emotion. But, in this case, she felt like an injustice, a moral wrong was being directed at her personally when she was told to move seats on that bus. Her resentment motivated her to say no, to refuse. And look what she started, right? So that feeling of resentment, that's what I mean. Like you have to bring in the moral reasoning and critical thinking skills along with it to decide what to do about that resentment. Because if you do nothing, or if you're not using those skills to do an effective thing, then the resentment just festers. And that's when resentment can become a negative emotion. But initially, resentment's not a bad thing. It can lead to really amazing results. Then we have guilt, another moral sentiment. Guilt is what alerts us and motivates us to correct a wrong we have committed. Guilt is a lot like pain. When you hurt yourself, you feel pain, and that pain motivates you to repair the injury in some way, right, before it gets infected or gets worse. Guilt also motivates us to avoid harming ourselves and others. We refrain from cheating on a test or stealing someone's property, even when no one is around to see us, because the very thought of doing so makes us feel guilty. Just like we don't want to put our hand over an open flame and hurt ourselves, right? We want to avoid the pain. Guilt, we avoid making these types of choices because we don't want to feel the pain of guilt, right? And it's frequently seen as a bad thing, right? It's often thought to be the reason why we can't just be happy. A lot of people feel like it's a barrier to personal freedom and happiness, and they end up reacting to it with resistance. We either ignore it or we get angry at the person who made us feel guilty. Happens a lot with my children, by the way. Not necessarily towards me, towards each other. People have a hard time dealing with guilt. It can really, it's amazing the barriers that we can throw up when we know deep down that we have done something wrong. We do not want to deal with the guilt. So the barriers, they'll come right up. But what's funny is that, we don't like to feel guilt. We don't want to feel guilt. We will even avoid feeling guilty by pretending it's not there. But yet, when we hear about someone who feels no guilt about doing bad things, like a sociopath, right? We view them as monsters. Like, we know we're supposed to feel guilt, but maybe we don't like the feeling of guilt. And maybe we don't want to admit that we are guilty, right? So, part of the reason why there's this uncertainty about guilt, partly because of some of the things I just said, but also because we have a tendency to confuse guilt with shame. Because guilt is often broadly defined to include shame as part of its nature. Part of guilt is shame. But that's actually not true. There are two different sentiments. Guilt results when we commit a moral wrong or violate a moral principle. When you steal, when you lie, right? We're not supposed to steal. We know that's not morally acceptable, morally right. And I don't want to say acceptable because that's not the right word. That makes it seem like it's arbitrary. It's not morally right to steal, and we know it's not morally right to lie. Those are moral principles that we're violating when we feel guilt. Shame is what we feel as a result of violating a social norm or not living up to someone else's expectations for us. That's shame, is when you make a decision or you behave in a way that you know will cause other people to look at you funny. We have violated a cultural norm. We're not living up to someone's expectation. We feel shame. But it is absolutely possible for a person to make a guilt-free decision, a decision that does not involve violating a moral principle, guilt-free decision, but still be made to feel shame about it. They are two different things. All right, let's take a look then at how moral reasoning develops. How does all this play out through our lifetime? All right, because we know that conscience has that affective / emotional side, and it has the cognitive aspect, and that this can aid in moral decision making. The emotional side includes moral sentiments that motivate us to take action. So we're going to look at the cognitive side of the development of morality and the different theories involved. Okay, so we have Lawrence Kohlberg. So he gave us the stage theory of moral development, right? So 1927 to 1987 is when he's alive and doing his thing. And he argues that human beings advance through distinct stages in their moral reasoning capabilities. These stages are transcultural, meaning around the world. And they represent increased efficiency and proficiency in critical thinking skills. Right? So our stages of moral development are that positive correlation in critical thinking skills. So the higher we get in these stages of moral development, we also see an increase in critical thinking skills. All right. So they've sort of taken his basic ideas here, and we have sort of narrowed it down to 3 levels of moral development: the pre-conventional level, the conventional level, and the pre-conventional level. And each of those levels contains 2 distinct stages. So 3 levels, 6 stages, right? So in our pre-conventional level, stage 1, our moral reasoning is all about avoiding punishment, right? We have a fear of punishment. We want to avoid it. This is where we are as young children. And if you think about the reasoning that goes into a young child making a decision, it's to avoid punishment, to do the right thing, right? To not, draw on the wall, right? Some kids just don't know that it's wrong yet. We're not talking about that. It's not like, you have to know that something is wrong before you can consciously decide to do it anyway, right? But it's all about fear of punishment. The next stage at the pre-conventional level is the egoist stage. So this is where we're at in our adolescence. Right? We put ourselves first. We satisfy our own needs, and we really only consider the needs of others if it benefits us. This is where young people are, especially if you think young criminals, putting themselves first, satisfying their own needs, not really caring about the needs of others unless it benefits them. And did you know that nearly half of all crimes are committed by young people between the ages of 15 and 24? Nearly half of all crimes are committed by young people between the ages of 15 and 24, where they would typically be in the egoist stage. Their moral reasoning has not advanced past this pre-conventional level just yet. Once we do, though, we get to the conventional level, right? So we're middle of the road. Stage 3, which is the first stage of the conventional level, is the good boy, nice girl phase. This is where we actually start to put others first. We want to please and help others. We become people pleasers. We want to maintain good relationships, and we want the approval of other people. We conform to peer norms. So when we say that we put others first, we're not necessarily meaning that we are self-sacrificing at this stage. It's that we're not looking internally, right? This is where we are as older teens and young adults, seeking the approval of others. Then we get to stage 4, which is the top tier of the conventional level here. And this is where we our moral reasoning is more related to our respect for authority and society's rules. Our decisions are based on trying to maintain the existing social order. And this is actually where most Americans are, because rather than thinking through decisions about moral issues, we just adopt the prevailing view. We're just going along with the group to maintain the existing social order and not, upset the status quo. That's where a lot of adults are. If we're lucky, though, we get to the post-conventional level. All right, so we have stage 5, which is all about the social contract and the legalistic aspect. So our moral reasoning at this stage is all about obeying useful and arbitrary social rules. We will still appeal to the social consensus and majority rule, but as long as minimal basic rights are safeguarded. So we won't go along like in stage 4. We won't necessarily just adopt the status quo view for the sake of not upsetting the status quo. Not that, not quite that, because someone in stage 4, they will do that even if basic rights are being violated. Someone at stage 5 is like, okay, I still don't really want to upset the status quo too much. However, I am not willing to turn a blind eye when basic rights are being violated. But as long as, minimal basic rights are safeguarded, then we still kind of go with the flow. Then we hit stage 6, conscience and universal moral principles. So at this stage, our moral reasoning is based on autonomously recognizing universal rules such as justice and equality that are rational and logically consistent and reflect a respect for equal human rights and the dignity of each individual. How many of us get there? Well, don't know. Not many. A person's stage of moral development is correlated with their behavior. And one study was done, and the researchers found, and this was about helping someone who was apparently suffering from side effects of drug use, right? Only 9% of people at stage 2, the egoist stage, where it's all about me and I really only want to help others if it benefits me. So remember, this is where we are, like late childhood into adolescence, maybe even still into our late teens, possibly. Only 9% of subjects at stage 2 would offer help to someone who appeared to be suffering from drug side effects. Only 38% of subjects at stage 4, the society maintaining stage where most adults are, only 38% of them would offer help to someone who they thought was experiencing side effects from drug use. 38%. Anyone at stage 6, the conscience and universal moral principles stage, everyone part of this study who has at stage 6 of their moral reasoning development offered help. Less than 10% of American adults ever reach the post-conventional level of moral reasoning. We stay here. So maybe some of us are still here. I don't know. I feel like maybe some of us are still here, right? Even as adults, even older than 24, right? But most of us are here. Only 10% of us ever get to here. Why does our moral reasoning not develop past the conventional level? Interesting. What's also important to keep in mind is people who are at the lower levels of moral reasoning, they tend to come up with very simplistic solutions to problems. And then when these solutions don't work or the solutions backfire and make things even worse, they are baffled. They don't understand how things went so wrong. We can't outgrow, though we can sort of advance to the next level, or at least get closer. When our old way of thinking no longer works to resolve more complex problems and issues. And just like we learned with critical thinking skills in general, moving to a higher stage of moral reasoning, just like moving to a stronger set of critical thinking skills, is usually triggered by new ideas and experiences that conflict with their worldview. So if you're living in an echo chamber, you are likely not going to develop past that conventional level because you're not being forced to feel uncomfortable with new experiences that conflict with your worldview. That cognitive dissonance isn't happening. But if the cognitive dissonance does happen, just like with your critical thinking skills, your moral reasoning skills can strengthen as well. Then we also have this other psychologist, Carol Gilligan, sorry. She looked at moral reasoning really more of from a gender perspective, because obviously Kohlberg really only did his research on men, and Gilligan was like, I'm not sure that women follow that same development that men do. I feel like they walk, they travel a different path when it comes to their moral reasoning. She said that men tend to be duty and principle oriented, what she called the justice perspective. But women, in contrast, view the world in terms of relationships and caring, what she called the care perspective. So her stages, there's just 3 stages. In the pre-conventional stage, she is saying that young girls, just like young boys, are self-centered, putting their own needs first. So there actually wasn't much of a gender difference there in the pre-conventional stage. At the conventional stage, though, Gilligan said that women tend to be self-sacrificing, putting the needs and welfare of others before their own, which can backfire. And it's not so much in the sense of like putting peer norms as the priority. It's that self-sacrificing idea. And then in the pre-conventional stage, though, women are able to balance their needs and the needs of others, what she calls mature care ethics. And the reality is, I think that might ring somewhat true to you, that progression for women. The reality, though, is that there's actually no gender differences, really, at least pretty insignificant ones, and that most people try to make use of both perspectives in their moral reasoning. So men and women both, will look at it from a justice perspective and a care perspective. All right. So I do think that it's worth thinking about her 2 different types of moral reasoning, the justice perspective and the care perspective. I don't think we necessarily need to view them as gender different, though, but it's just 2 more perspectives to sort of fold into Kohlberg's theory of moral development. That some people will, have this justice perspective. Some people will have the care perspective. Most people will try to sort of embrace both, depending on the situation, perhaps, right? So it's interesting. It's interesting that research didn't really back up what she was saying in terms of the gender role, but it does sort of back up just the foundation of what she's saying, that justice perspective and care perspective. All right, so now, we have our basic idea of moral reasoning and how it develops. Some of that development comes with age. Some of that development comes with what our society, culture, religion, and families sort of influence us with. The higher levels of moral reasoning tend to come with that cognitive dissonance and the willingness to be confronted with information and perspectives that conflict with what you already know and believe. When you can grow from that, when you can evolve from that, your critical thinking skills and your moral reasoning, they sort of level up. Right? Let's look here at some moral theories. All right, so we have, moral theories that provide frameworks for understanding and explaining what makes a certain action right or wrong. Right? They also help us clarify, analyze, and rank moral concerns that are raised by the moral issues in our lives. And there are 2 basic types of moral theories: the moral relativists and the moral universalists. So the inability of many people to make universal moral judgments on issues like abortion and capital punishment it contributes to this really widespread feeling that our positions on moral issues are simply matters of personal opinion, which then makes us think that there's really no need to discuss them. But there's no room for discussion because everyone has a different opinion and we're allowed to have different opinions. But if you really look at different moral theories, you soon realize that some moral theories are better than others for explaining morality and providing solutions to those moral issues. It might not be as much a matter of opinion as we think it is. All right, so in our first group of moral theories, we're looking at the relativists, where morality is relative. Our first type of moral relativist is the ethical subjectivist. And according to ethical subjectivists, morality is nothing more than personal opinion or feelings. What feels right for you is right for you at any given moment. Does robbing a bank make you feel good? Well, then it's the morally correct thing for you to do. Weird, right? Don't confuse ethical subjectivism, though, with the observation that people believe in different moral values. Ethical subjectivism is not saying it's okay, everybody has different moral values. No, ethical subjectivism is going beyond that. And they're claiming that sincerely believing or feeling something is right makes it right. A person can never be right or wrong. If it's right for you, it's right. You're not violating any moral codes or whatnot. If robbing that bank makes you feel good, if you feel like it is the right thing for you to do, then that makes it right. Also, don't confuse ethical subjectivism with tolerance, right? It is literally saying that this is what morality is. Morality is what feels right to you. And it's definitely one of the weakest moral theories, right? Having a right to our own opinions is not the same as saying that all opinions are equally reasonable. It is not reasonable to say that it is morally right to rob a bank because I believe it is so. Nope, nope. It's not going to work, right? And people who claim to be ethical subjectivists, where, hey, it feels right to you, then it is morally right. They tend to sing a different tune when they themselves are unfavorably affected by someone else's harmful actions, right? So, if robbing or if stealing someone's car makes you feel good, if you feel like it is the right thing for you to do, then it is right. It is morally right for you to steal that car. That's what an ethical subjectivist would say. Until it's their car. And then it's like, oh, wait, no, you stole my car? No, that's wrong. Or would they? Do they truly feel like it's just total chaos and anarchy and it's fine? Like, well, sucks to be me, but you did the right thing. You did the morally right thing because it's what you believed was right for you. And I'm just gonna have to go look for a new vehicle, I guess. I don't see anybody reacting that way. They would be upset, right? So is ethical subjectivism even truly possible in a real situation, not in a hypothetical? I don't know. But it is the weakest of the moral theories. The opposite, I don't really want to say opposite, but conversely, we have the other relativist theory, which is cultural relativism. And instead of looking at inwardly, what you feel and believe is right, well, then that's the moral thing to do. It's looking at cultural relativism is looking culturally. right? They're looking to public opinion and custom to determine morality. Morality is nothing more than socially approved customs to cultural relativists. So if you are a cultural relativist and you are trying to figure out the moral or right thing to do, all you have to do is look at what the customs and laws of your culture or society are right now to know what is right and wrong. This is an interesting take on morality here because 2 centuries ago, slavery was morally acceptable in parts of the United States. Today, Americans everywhere are going to condemn slavery as highly immoral. So cultural relativists aren't just saying that Americans once thought slavery was morally acceptable. They're saying slavery actually was morally acceptable prior to 1863 because it was the cultural norm. And it was not the slave owners who were immoral, but the abolitionists. The abolitionists were the immoral ones because they were the ones opposing the cultural standards of their time. So it's basically just what's right for your culture is right for you. What's right for your culture right now. That's morally right for you. The problem with this is that it can be used to legitimate the oppression of certain groups. It also becomes a big deal when two cultures disagree over what is morally right. There's no shared universal moral values necessarily. I mean, we do have some, but there's it's like cultures where it is morally acceptable to stone your wife or a wife who has committed adultery. And that wouldn't fly here in the United States. What happened, but a cultural relativist is saying doesn't matter how we feel in the United States. That's not our culture. It's not our cultural custom. It's their cultural custom. Therefore, it is morally acceptable for them to participate in it. Genital mutilation. It is a standard part of some cultures. It is morally right, morally acceptable in those cultures, and doesn't matter what any other culture says. That's what a cultural relativist would say. So other countries trying to intervene and stop these customs from happening, they're the ones in the wrong. That's what a cultural relativist would say. What happens when someone who grew up in these cultures transplants and is now living in a country and a culture where those things are no longer morally acceptable? When people of certain tribes come to the United States for whatever reason, and we will assume that legally here, and they've been here for a year, they haven't just abandoned their culture just because they're no longer geographically located in that culture. Do they come here and is it morally right for them to still engage in genital mutilation here in the United States? It can lead to really dicey conflicts, right? And when one culture feels offended or threatened by another, the only solutions in these cases, according to a cultural relativist, because both cultures are morally right, the only solution is just isolationism or war. So you can kind of see, while certain aspects of cultural relativism make sense on the surface, when you follow it through to its end, Cultural relativism is not necessarily a great moral theory to go by. But then we have the other group here where morality is universal. We have moral universalism. Most moral philosophers believe that morality is universal, that moral principles are binding on all people regardless of their personal desires, culture, or religion. So they are looking at the subjectivist and saying, no, a person's desires have nothing to do with morality. They're looking at the cultural relativists and saying, no, culture and religion are not the basis of morality. Morality is universal. Right? And there are 4 different types of universal moral theories: utilitarianism, deontology, natural rights ethics, and virtue ethics. Right? So what's interesting about these universalism, though, is that they aren't diametrically opposite of each other the way ethical subjectivists and cultural relativists are. You can't really be both. You cannot be an ethical subjectivist and a cultural relativist. Within the universalism, though, these 4 universal moral theories, they can work together. They can, enrich and sort of complement each other. Right? But first we have utilitarianism. This is where, moral reasoning, how we make moral decisions, is based on consequences. And it's not a fear of punishment. It's literally just the consequences of your action. Right? So according to utilitarians, actions that bring the most happiness to the greatest number of people reflect the principle of utility, or the greatest happiness principle. So Jeremy Bentham in the 19th century, he develops this utilitarian calculus as a means of determining which actions or policies are morally preferable. So we're looking at intensity, duration, certainty, propinquity, fecundity, purity, extent. We're not going to go into all of those in detail. The idea, though, is just that there's like this mathematical formula for making moral decisions, according to utilitarianism. And it's, I'll come back to that. All right. So in deciding the best policy, a utilitarian doesn't simply go along with what the majority wants, because people are not always well informed. One of the strengths of utilitarianism is that it requires us to be well informed about the possible consequences of our actions or inaction before we make moral decisions. It's good to know, to think about the consequences. That's actually a great strength of utilitarianism, is forcing us to think of all of the different possibilities. It also does not let people make excuses, right? You can't say, I didn't intend any harm. That doesn't work as an excuse, because you according to utilitarianism, you should have planned for every possibility. Or don't blame me, I was just a bystander. That doesn't work either. That's part of our moral reasoning should be thinking about possible consequences of our actions or inaction. The problem with utilitarianism, though, is that it's very cold and calculated, and it does not take into account individuals. For instance, let's say you've got a facility or an area of a state where your dialysis machines are numbered, very limited, and you have far more patients in need of dialysis machines than what you have machines available. How do you do that? How do you determine who gets a dialysis machine and who doesn't? Right? According to utilitarianism, you're going to go back to this utilitarian calculus, and you're going to start treating it like a math problem. Right? And some of these questions, it seems very calculated, but some of them aren't, right? Like the strength of the pleasure and pain, the length of time, the level of probability. You know, you're applying these very cold mathematical things to something that is very human, people needing kidney dialysis. And as people, as a team of people might be going through that utilitarian calculus and trying to whittle it down, they're making decisions, and thinking about, who will have the most benefit to society, whose probable death due to not getting a machine will have the least effect on society, that sort of thing. And the problem is that, someone might feel like the pastor waiting for a dialysis machine is the best one to save. He will have the most profound effect on society if we're able to save him. Someone else might be like, not to diss the pastor, but what about this teacher? And then someone be like, what about this poet? What about this artist? What about this tech genius? Right? Like, that's the flaw with utilitarianism. It's not so much wrong as it is incomplete. Its weakness is that it's not that looking at the consequences is bad. It's that only looking at consequences is bad. There's more to morality and moral decision making, which takes us to deontology. The deontology claims that duty is the foundation of morality, not this calculus, right? Some acts are morally obligatory regardless of their consequences. There are certain things that we simply must feel morally compelled to do, regardless of the consequences. So that calculus isn't really going to help us because there are certain moral obligations where the consequences don't matter in the first place. We just have to do them, right? We should do our duty purely out of a sense of goodwill, not because of a reward, not for fear of punishment, and not because of any other consequences. So we have our German philosopher Immanuel Kant, who devises the categorical imperative. And you may have never heard of that phrase before in your life, but I guarantee you, in some ways, you live your life according to his categorical imperative. The first component of his imperative says, act only on that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law. Here's an example. If it's wrong to lie, it is wrong for everyone to lie. Even when we tell children that Santa Claus is real. He believes that all rational beings will recognize the categorical imperative as universally binding. Crosses time, crosses cultures. The categorical imperative, he believed, was the one true element, right? It is our ability to reason that gives us moral worth. And since humans and other rational beings have intrinsic worth and dignity, they should never be treated as expendable in the way that they can be under utilitarian theory. So, for instance, utilitarian theory, looking at that dialysis machine example, they're going through the utilitarian calculus, and it's very cold and methodical, and they're not taking anything into account, perhaps, that matters. And Kant's saying, who cares if one person says the pastor should get a machine and the other one is saying the teacher should get the machine? Fact of the matter is, every single person in need of one of those machines should get a machine. So thinking about moral decisions, looking only at the consequences and using this calculus isn't going to work because they all deserve it, right? The other part of his categorical imperative says, because of this, so act as to treat humanity, whether in thine own person or in that of any other, in every case as an end in itself, never as a means only. I know that is some really strange language, but if you want to whittle it down, this moral obligation, his categorical imperative, it is found in moral philosophy and religious ethics around the world, and we often refer to it as the golden rule. In Buddhism, the concept comes as hurt not others in ways that you yourself would find hurtful. In Christianity, we say it, always treat others as you would like them to treat you, or excuse me, or do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Treat other people how you want to be treated. Confucianism, do not do to others what you do not want them to do to you. Hinduism, this is the sum of the Dharma, duty. Do not unto others which would cause pain if done to you. Islam, none of you truly believes until he wishes for his brother what he wishes for himself. Judaism, thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Even in Native American spirituality, respect for all life is the foundation. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. That is Kant's categorical imperative, the duty of reciprocity. And it's everything. That is a huge component of morality. Now, the problem though, it's a great mantra to live by. It is a great philosophy to live by. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. The problem though is that, can you just live life that way? Do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Are you able to abide by that moral code in every single situation? And most deontologists, while they agree that the categorical imperative is super important, what they see is that there are situations where moral duties may come into conflict. So this other philosopher, W.D. Ross, he comes up with a list of 7 duties that are sort of derived from the categorical imperative. Like, that way, if you run into a situation where moral duties come into conflict, are we, how can we sort of sift through those while keeping the categorical imperative in mind? All right. So we have what he calls the 7 prima facie duties. First 2 are future-looking duties, right? The duty to do good acts and promote happiness and non-maleficence. The duty to do no harm and to prevent harm. Those are duties that we have, moral obligations that we have. We also have duties based on past obligation. So a duty of fidelity, which is a duty arising from past commitments and promises, right? If you promised to help a friend move from one house to the next, you have a moral obligation, the duty of fidelity, to keep that promise. We have the duty of reparation, which duties that stem from past harm to others. We make mistakes, we have to make up for them, right? That is the duty of reparation. It is a moral obligation. Then we have gratitude, duties based on past favors and unearned services, right? When someone does us a favor, or when something is done for us that we didn't pay for, that we have not reciprocated, we have the duty of gratitude, morally obligated. We have ongoing duties, self-improvement and justice. We are morally obligated to both of those. right? We have these 7 prima facie duties, and when we come into situations where, you know, simply going by the categorical imperative doesn't really work, we can come to the 7 prima facie duties and sort of figure out if one supersedes the other. Right? We have an example here. Right? So you borrowed money from a friend, and when they arrive to collect what you owe them, you can see that they are furious. They are angry about something. You know, you ask them if they're okay, and they are not okay, and they tell you how they are livid, they are irate, and all kinds of upset because they just failed their chemistry exam. And, you know, they've got a lot of reasons why, they go on, but, you know, all you really get from the conversation is how mad they are because they failed their exam, and your friend needs the money that you owe them right away so that they can finish making the bomb that they're going to use to blow up the science building. Should you give them money? Well, we have several prima facie duties involved here, right? Because you know, we have fidelity and gratitude, both of those duties coming into play. Past commitments and promises, and duties based on past favors and unearned services. But we also have the non-maleficence duty, the duty to do no harm and to prevent harm. And in this case, that future-looking duty sort of overpowers the duties based on past obligation. So you could reason morally that it's better for you to not give him the money, despite the moral duty that is there to give him the money. There is another moral duty involved that supersedes that one. I don't mind the 7 prima facie duties way of looking at things. I don't think it will work every time, even still, but it's an interesting way of sort of helping yourself reason through what's right? Especially when you are faced with tough decisions. I think it can help by thinking of that categorical imperative and how the 7 prima facie duties in their order of importance can help you make heads or tails out of it. Then we have rights-based ethics, right? So in rights-based ethics, moral rights are not identical to legal rights like they are in cultural relativism. Because we have moral rights, others have a duty to honor these rights. The right to pursue our interests without interference from others is limited to our legitimate interests. That is, those interests that do not harm other people by violating their similar and equal interests, right? Like, your freedom ends where, ends where mine ends. You can't infringe on someone else's legitimate rights in the pursuit of your own, right? Moral rights under rights-based ethics are generally divided into 2 areas. We have our welfare rights, which is like our right to receive certain social goods that are essential to our well-being. So things like education, police protection, fire protection, emergency medical care, even if we don't have the ability to pay, right? Those are welfare rights. They're moral rights, though. Society is like morally obligated to provide those to us. Then we have our liberty rights. These are the rights to be left alone to pursue our legitimate interests. So our freedom of speech. It is a liberty right. We have the right to free speech as long as our right isn't infringing upon someone else's right. Religion, career, education, privacy, liberty rights, right? So rights-based ethics is an important component of moral theory because rights protect our equality and dignity as persons. And like duties, like the 7 prima facie duties, rights may come into conflict with each other or with other duties. And when this happens, we need to make sure we're using good critical thinking skills to decide which are the more compelling moral rights and duties, right? They're going to come into conflict with each other. You need to be able to critically evaluate all of them so that you can determine, like, okay, there's several rights involved here. There's several moral rights involved. There's some welfare rights and there's some liberty rights. Which ones are most compelling? Which ones are a little more important than the others that could determine the course of action we should take? All right. Then we have our virtue ethics. Virtue ethics emphasize character over right action. So the sort of person we are constitutes the heart of our moral life, not what we do. A virtue is an admirable character trait or disposition that where we habitually act in a manner that benefits ourselves and others. So compassion, courage, generosity, loyalty, honesty, those are all virtues. When we say someone is a virtuous person, what that means is that they are, they have what's called moral sensitivity, the awareness of how their actions affect others. So you can kind of see how virtue ethics can go along with the other universal moral theories, right? We're going to come here to moral arguments right now. So, like any argument, a moral argument is going to have a premise and a conclusion. The difference is that with moral arguments, one of the premises has to be a prescriptive premise, meaning it is a statement regarding what is morally right or wrong, or what ought to be done or ought not to be done, right? And then we also have descriptive premises that go along with it, but one of them has to be a prescriptive premise. And that's, we're saying what ought to be done, right? Making a moral argument here. If there was ever a time when it's important to get your facts straight, it's now, when you're making any kind of moral argument, because incorrect facts and assumptions in a moral argument can lead to a very faulty conclusion, and we may end up doing more harm than good, right? All right. When you're constructing a moral argument, it's just like constructing any other argument, except again, one of the premises must be prescriptive, saying what should be done, right? But you have to first identify the issue clearly, right? Let's say you're taking a ride to class with your friend, and while she's pulling into her parking spot, she scrapes the fender of another car, and she just starts to pull out and leave. And you're like, oh, we're okay. That's how this is going to go. What do I do? Probably not going to be too comfortable with the situation, right? So the issue is, your friend scrapes the fender of a car in the parking lot. What should she do? What should you do? So remember, a lot of times we can phrase issues in the form of a question. So our descriptive premises, again, just descriptions and facts. Your friend damaged the fender of the car next to her when she pulled her car into the parking spot. That's what happened. Your friend was driving her parents' car. Also a fact. Your friend is concerned that her parents will get angry when they learn about the accident. Also a fact. Now, our prescriptive premises. What should be done? What ought to be done? We have a moral duty to make up for past harms that we cause others. That's the duty of reparation. Remember, part of the categorical imperative and the 7 prima facie duties. Okay. So we're supposed to do that. We ought to do that. That's a prescriptive premise. The person whose car your friend struck has a right to be compensated for the damage. That's a welfare right, right? That's something that ought to be done. You have a duty to be kind and caring to your friend. That's the duty of beneficence. So you're not going to shame your friend. You're not going to yell at them. And you're not going to force them to take a certain course of action. And you're not going to turn them in. right? You have a duty of loyalty to your friend. Your friend's interests should be more important to you than the random person whose car fender she scraped, right? That's the duty of fidelity. And then we have our straight categorical imperative, our golden rule. You want to treat others the way you want to be treated. Well, I don't want someone to scrape, hit my car and then drive off without leaving me a note at least, right? So if you sift through those prescriptive premises, it is pretty clear that something needs to happen other than just her driving away, right? She can't just drive away. There's no way that's not right. But you don't want to shame her or guilt her into feeling that way. You have to go through all of these different prescriptive premises to see what they can lead to. If they can lead to a compromise that is going to allow her to do the right thing without fear, right? So we've got these different duties, making up the duty of reparation, the welfare right, and the categorical imperative. Those three are saying you have to own up to this, right? You have to face the consequences. And then the other two, the duty of beneficence and duty of fidelity, that's you saying, okay, but you're my friend and I'm not trying to throw you under the bus and I'm not trying to make you feel bad. All right, so what can we do? Maybe what you guys come up with looking at your prescriptive premises is, she's going to leave a note on the car with her information, and then you're going to go with her to talk to her parents when she tells them about the accident. So, reinforcement, moral support, possibly, it will curb her parents' urge to have a big reaction about it, right? You can be there as a witness to, help explain what happened, to verify that she did leave her information, to, that her parents, don't accuse her of fleeing the scene, that sort of thing. It's as close to a win-win as you can get without building a time machine and not having the accident happen in the first place, right? Remember, while we're having this conversation and going through all of this with our friend, the point is not to prove that we are morally superior to her. Her fear is valid. We're not judging her for feeling the urge to just leave. Nobody goes with me. My parent, I can't handle my parents yelling at me. She's that. It's okay that she feels that way. We're not trying to make her feel bad. We're just trying to help her do the right thing without making her feel bad, right? That's the type of conversation we're having when we're going through the descriptive and prescriptive premises and trying to come up with a conclusion that is morally sound, right? All right. Evaluating moral arguments. Oh boy. All right, so we have looked at how to evaluate different types of arguments. We looked at our, all the different informal fallacies that can show up in an argument. We looked at, recognizing argument in general. We've looked at inductive arguments, deductive arguments, right? We have talked quite a bit about evaluating argument. And the fact is it's no different when it's a moral argument. You want to make sure they're free of informal fallacies. You want to make sure that you are not participating in any kind of barriers to critical thinking, and you want to spot barriers to critical thinking in others while you're discussing things about moral issues. And you want to make sure that, that you are using all the same critical thinking skills that we've already discussed, even though it's a moral argument now. Look for the informal fallacies back in chapter 5. All of them could appear in moral arguments. Remember, rhetoric can be there, right? The ones that show up a lot, though, in moral arguments are the naturalistic fallacy, where because it's natural, it's good. This can show up. Let's look at the legalization of marijuana. A lot of people will support the legalization of marijuana by saying marijuana is natural. There's nothing wrong with it, right? And that's not to say that the claim is wrong, not to say that marijuana shouldn't be legal, but just that saying that it should be legal because it's natural isn't the best way to support that claim, because it's the naturalistic fallacy. Popular appeal, fallacy of popular appeal. That's going to show up a lot too. Hasty generalization and slippery slope fallacy. Those four show up in moral arguments all the time. So be aware of that, because when we have an informal fallacy, the argument is automatically weakened. Does that mean that the person is wrong? Not necessarily, but we won't know for sure until they give us an argument that is not flawed by informal fallacies. They can clean up the informal fallacies and come back with a strong argument, void of fallacies. Then maybe we can see if what they're saying is right, if we agree with them, right? So again, it's not to say like I can have a student turn in a paper about the legalization of marijuana, and maybe in their paper they're trying to say marijuana should be legalized for medicinal and recreational use, period. And let's say, personally, I agree. But if you turn in a paper to me that is full of informal fallacies and, half-cocked ideas, and it's clear you haven't looked at all perspectives, that sort of thing, I'm still going to give you a little grade, even though I agree with the ultimate claim that they're making, right? Or just the opposite. I could have a student writing on a topic that I completely disagree with, but if they make a strong argument, void of fallacy, that's a strong argument. Doesn't matter if I disagree with it or not. I can recognize that it's a strong argument. That's the goal here, is to look at these moral arguments and not let yourself simply agree with someone because you feel like you agree with them. Make them do the work to provide an argument that is valid and sound and void of informal fallacies. Then you know for sure. We also have what's called moral dilemmas, right? This is where there's a conflict between moral values, sort of what we were talking about with the deontologists, where they're like, yeah, that categorical imperative is pretty important, but not always so cut and dry, right? Sometimes there's conflict, even among moral duties. Right? So the idea with resolving a moral dilemma is to find a solution that honors as many moral values as possible, right? So evaluate it just like you would any other conflict and argument that you're trying to sift through. So being able to recognize moral arguments and developing skills to evaluate moral reasoning are very important factors in critical thinking. They're very important factors in our daily lives and our lives as citizens in the cities and towns and states and country where we live. There is a positive correlation between your level of moral reasoning and your level of critical thinking ability. Effective critical thinking requires not only that we be aware of our own moral values, but that we be open-minded and willing to respect the concerns and values of others. Right? Okay. you have any questions, reach out. Otherwise, free to go ahead and move on to the next topic.